Welcome to When the Facts Change for this, my regular weekly show released on Fridays, exclusively on my When the Facts Change Substack. Well, 2026 began with a geopolitical bang, as we discussed on the last edition of When the Facts Change. And with President Trump taking his threats of tariffs on Europe to the annual Davos Gabfest and ongoing turmoil in Venezuela and Iran, to say nothing of continued war in Ukraine, the sense we're on the cusp of a new world order continues to grow. Yet despite that, global equity markets keep rising. The S&P 500, the main US stock index, gained 17% last year, and the London-based FTSE 100 put on 21%. And despite huge geopolitical angst, stock markets are still going up. But I'd say that valuations now look very toppy. At the time of the 2008 global financial crisis, the S&P 500 cyclically adjusted Shiller price-earnings ratio was up above 25, a very high valuation, ahead of what was a major downward correction, of course. Today, after markets surged then fell sharply during COVID lockdown, valuations are even higher than ahead of the 2008 collapse. The same S&P Shiller index is now above 40, dot-com boom territory, with share indices these days pumped up by AI-related stocks. Can these sky-high valuations continue amidst ongoing sluggish growth across the West, to say nothing of a looming sovereign debt crisis? I'm not so sure. I discuss all this and more with the finance industry legend that is Justin Urquhart-Stewart. We chat not just stock market valuations, but ask why there are now so few share listings in the City of London. When it comes to Trump and Greenland, what is America's endgame? And with the US president dominating the headlines, what's been going on in Venezuela and Iran over recent days, as much of the world has been focused on an Arctic outpost the size of Mexico and Saudi Arabia, but with a population of less than 60,000. I get the geopolitical lowdown from BEN ARIS, founder and editor of the emerging markets focused news site BNE IntelliNews. Easy to access at intellinews.com, Ben's site specialises in business news not just from the post-communist world, but also from Africa, Latin America and the Middle East. Join us on When the Facts Change for a fascinating conversation. This week's show also takes a look at the UK steel industry, amid reports that the contract for 7,000 tonnes of steel for a government-backed net zero project on Teesside has been awarded to a Chinese supplier. What future for Britain's once pioneering steel industry after last September's closure of the Tata Steel blast furnace at Port Talbot? Does it matter if Britain can no longer produce superior strength virgin steel? I'm joined in the When the Facts Change studio by Simon Boyd, Managing Director of Reed Steel, a man with decades of experience at the top of the UK's steel industry, helping to run major facilities across the country. So it's a packed show here on When the Facts Change. Thanks so much to my paying subscribers for supporting me and independent media more generally. Lots to discuss, so let's get started. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, great to have you with us. So much geopolitics happening, so much uncertainty, so much angst out there in terms of news flow across the world. And yet for now, financial markets seem largely to be taking it in their stride. Why is that?
I'm astonished. Being an old fart who's been around far too long, I have to say I've never seen a level of risk and a level of sometimes complacency in the market when you add up all the issues, which on any other occasion you'd sit there and say, well, there's some wars going on. That's a reason for the market to be uncertain. There are other economic issues, political issues, a rather strange individual running the American state. All of those elements would have put the fear of God into most people and found a very good reason to go invest elsewhere and sell out of the market. Well, of course, people have been selling out of the market, and there's one clear measure of what's happening there, and that is, of course, the gold price and silver price. And as we all know, people only look at that when there's nowhere else to go. But I've never been a big fan of gold because it doesn't do anything. You can hold it, lick it, suck it, do what you like, but it doesn't give you any dividend, no compounding. It just goes up or down. But in the meantime, what you've got is all these threats compounding together. And the market at the moment is almost saying, well, we'll tolerate. Nothing's so bad that we're actually going to panic out of it yet. But there is going to be a trigger at some stage. And I hate being a Cassandra saying, we're doomed. I'm not sure if Cassandra ever said that. But actually in a position where people should be concerned. But we should. Because nothing carries on in a hardly straight line, but a line going up forever. So now is the time to be suitably circumspect. Not that you're going to try and call yourself as the next great seer to foresee the next movement in the market, but to be suitably conservative. Take some profit, take some money off the table. And because the great thing about the stock market, subject to us actually going to somewhere absolutely horrendous, it'll still be there. It's the horse race that keeps on running. And you can come back and at a better time when you feel a bit more confident, and more to the point, the things you want to buy are cheaper. So don't be greedy, be sensible, and actually use some common sense with it. You don't have to be Warren Buffett to actually be successful in this market.
Stepping back, Justin, let's look at diagnostics of market valuation. Let's look at what we call the Case-Shiller cyclically adjusted index, one of the major kind of P ratios of the world. Of course, when a P ratio is high, that means stocks are valued richly compared to the amount of revenue and profit companies are actually generating. A low P ratio, say below 10 for companies, means that maybe you're getting a lot of revenue, a lot of profit in your business for the stock price you're actually paying. You know well, the S&P 500, the world's most important share index, stuffed full of US-based stocks, it's now above 40, which is extremely highly valued. It was way over where it was at the time of the 2008 financial crisis. It was roughly 30. The Case-Shiller cyclically adjusted index of the S&P 500 is now approaching where it was at the height of the dot-com boom. And instead of dot-com stocks, we've got AI stocks. Over half the S&P 500 valuation now is AI related stocks. You've got the market cap of Nvidia, which is worth more than all but 3 economies in the world. I mean, this is madness. This is total hype, isn't it?
You're right. Use some common sense with this. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And the echoes of the dot-com bubble are there. Yes, the companies are different, the circumstances are different, but when you look at things like those PE figures, they are completely outlandish, bearing in mind in America, where they're not that keen on dividends anyway. It's places like the UK where we rely much more on dividends and compounding of them to actually create wealth. But it's got to the stage now where this isn't a stock market, it's a betting market, and it's back to that stage again. Back in, we always hear back in the 20s where you get your tips from the shoeshine boy. But back in that world again, enhanced by all those bettors who went into crypto, not understanding what it is, and now, of course, add AI to it, which I suspect some people have trouble actually spelling, let alone understanding, unless you come from Yorkshire, in which case it's probably EI. And they've got the situation now where is it actually AI or is it just advanced Google search for the time being? AI is a thing, but we can't really prove it yet. And so therefore, you're betting on a bet without actually really understanding what it is. That's a bad thing to invest in. I mean, all means, have some exposure to it. That's okay. But something's going to happen, and it won't be the stunningly obvious. It'll be something off the left field, which will suddenly be enough just to trigger a change. And you'll see things pulling back again. Now, if you're scared and you're worried about it and you think the whole world's about to end, courtesy of Mr. Putin and 1 or 2 other individuals, then it's very simple. We buy a good case of scotch and go and sit in a cave in Scotland. If, however, you
Which
assume...
is where you are, of course. You're joining us.
Just in case, so I can sit here in Edinburgh and no one's going to attack me here, I think. But they've got, let's assume that we're not all going to end up in some awful disaster. The markets will take a tumble, the economies will have a shake, but in due course it'll come back again. So take a longer-term view and find yourself being a bit more circumspect. There's nothing wrong with taking some money out. It's not as if you're going off and spending it. Nothing wrong with that either. But actually, just be careful, because learn from history. You don't have to be an expert. Take some, even a bit of courage. It's just actually common sense. We all know it's gone too far. The valuations are great. That's marvellous. Bank some of it. It's like one of those awful television games. You have to sort of say, play bank, get the money. Well, yes, we'll do that. The money, you've made some money out of it. That's great, whether it was actually anything to do with our common sense or not, or good investment. But we are where we are, so use it to your advantage. And in a few months' time, you'll find one of Britain's or one of the world's greatest sales. That's this, where you're going to be able to buy companies at a much, much better value. with a better idea of actually who's going to survive.
You're intimating there that there is going to be some kind of major correction on equity markets when those that have banked some of their gains can then buy back the same stocks a lot cheaper and so do well for themselves. Of course, no one knows what that's going to happen. No one knows when the spark for that is going to be. And yet, Justin, you're a significant figure in the City of London. You eat, sleep and breathe this stuff. You have many, many conversations with extremely knowledgeable people every day. Is there a buzz about that? Is there a sense that some kind of correction is coming down the track?
Yes, and there was several months ago from people who are looking quite sensibly and looking back at the dot-com market and looking at those PEs and just saying, actually, this is looking rather worrying. Now tie that together with all those political issues you were mentioning and economic issues, and it's unnerving, and it's a time when we don't really understand. It was bad enough at .com. You could sort of vaguely understand .com now, but it's taken us several years to work it out. Remember those days, though? We were betting on companies that just had .com at the end of it, and that was it. Did they know what they were doing? No, not really. And so the same also with AI. The good news is, of course, actually, the global economy, yes, has got some real pressure cookers in it, but it's also got some areas which are going to continue to grow despite the frightening headlines. So look at Southeast Asia and South Asia. These are economies where you're seeing the growth of the financially aware middle class. And certainly you can see that in not just Singapore, but the likes of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And, this is a great area where I think you're going to see more development. And that's where I would actually see, I'd like to see our London Stock Exchange linked together, use our strength and knowledge of history and international markets. Remember, America's terrible at this. They're very good at dealing with world markets known as the American markets.
Yeah.
Everything else is somewhere else. Whereas London's great opportunity always has been, we were the international market. You can trade in any currency you like, you can trade in all sorts of stocks, but we've lost our impetus and also our pride, linked together back to the Middle East, back to the Far East, and be able to encourage. There's a lot of money out there waiting to invest. It needs the right channels to do so. What London's done is managed to adjust the financial plumbing so that somehow what used to be easy to invest in has now made itself far more complicated. And that's come home in Britain as well, because you actually look at people's pension funds and things. How much actually invested in Britain? The answer is a tiny amount. And the number of times I've spoken to some of the local authorities, the local authority pension funds, who say, so where's your money being invested? And, well, they don't know. It's with a fund manager in London, and it's a well-balanced, asset-allocated portfolio. And answer the question, how much is actually invested in Britain? Don't know. How much in Birmingham? Don't know. And I'm not saying out of charity you should do so, but why, if you took more interest, you've got local businesses there, you know what they're like, you know how successful otherwise, because you live next door to them. Actually, to redirect some of that money into our local businesses. There's no shortage of money. We haven't got the local stock exchanges you want anymore, because frankly, you don't need any more silly gits in red braces. In 1945, we had 45 stock exchanges. They were a waste of time. But my old place, the old Glasgow Stock Exchange, which was the last one to shut, we started AIM there, and for 150 years, it was providing local investment for local businesses. Now, we can actually go back to this in terms of, not in terms of all stock exchanges, but look at the area of strength in the UK economy. We've got really good tech hubs. All those areas which, and they've all got their nicknames, Silicon Roundabout, Silicon Gorge, Silicon Beach, Silicon Fen, Silicon Glen, Silicon Implant. No, that's not right. That's another one. But all those other areas, and they breed, because once you've got a small number of tech companies there, they spin off.
Cluster.
And what they need is capital. And
Justin, let's come on to that. I want to talk to you about the serious drop-off in listings in the City of London. What do we mean by that? Initial public offerings, IPOs, when companies actually choose London as a place to headquarter their business and raise their finance. An incredible drop-off in recent years. Want to get your sense on that, because, of course, that has major economic implications for the tax base and professional services and all the rest of it. And also, I do want to get your thoughts on how we can help to channel Britain's vast wealth of savings and pension assets into our local businesses. A major, major problem we have in this country, I think. But before we do that, we've talked a bit about equity markets. We agree massive overvaluation in equity markets. We agree that AI is obviously a thing, the big fifth industrial revolution. And yet, this stuff doesn't happen in a straight line. There's going to be regulatory squalls. There's going to be loads of consolidation. There's going to be a lot of failures amidst all the successes there will be. And yet all AI stocks, or most of them, are massively hyped up. So we've talked about equity markets. Let's talk briefly about bond markets. In other words, the market for debt, corporate debt, and in particular, sovereign debt. In the context when, Donald Trump, who you've likened to Mickey Mouse and the Sorcerer's Apprentice in that brilliant Disney film back in the day, he is obviously hot and heavy on Jerome Powell, who's going to be replaced in May. He seems to be, like Recep Erdogan style, publicly beating up his central banker, even though he appointed Powell back in the day in Trump's first term, reappointed by Biden. And of course, the Federal Reserve, the world's most significant central bank. But in that context, let's talk about sovereign bond yields. Obviously, our own country, the UK, has been an outlier, very high borrowing costs for our government, even though we don't have the biggest stock of sovereign debt in Western Europe. We're about 100% of GDP. Of course, other countries, some of them significantly more. What is happening on government debt markets? What are they saying to us? Because yields are elevated, yields are going up, even though central bankers have been lowering policy rates. And what's going on, Justin, with this Japanese long bond? Why should anyone care about the Japanese long bond, a sort of moribund corner of global finance?
It's strange, isn't it? And Japan really has had a torrid time over the past few years, both in bonds and equities. But the bond market's really important because apart from else, put into scale, probably 5 or 6 times bigger than global equity markets. I mean, this is vast, and yet most people don't really understand how it all works. Britain, of course, is a rather strange situation because our debt, which you say, about 100% in terms of the value of GDP in terms of debt, but perversely, 30% of that debt is actually owned by us, or by the government, or by the Treasury, or various combinations thereof. Because of quantitative easing, which of course 30 years ago no one had ever heard of before, actually by printing this debt and giving that as debt support for the government, we are in a funny position that actually the government's in effect, will probably be receiving about 30%, about 35 billion in coupons or dividends going back via the Bank of England. Now, it's not done quite as obviously as that, but those coupons do go through. So perversely, we've got this debt and we're earning money off it. Actually, although you've got to be careful, you don't frighten the markets, you could actually sit there and say, well, if I own the debt and I've got the debt and the asset, you could cross each other off in terms of the balance sheet. Now, be careful, because you'd scare the horses doing so. But it does put into perspective that actually our position isn't necessarily as frightening as others. Now, you look at what's happened in Japan. Japan's in a situation where they've funded themselves with their debt. It's been in a position where it's been relatively cheap overall, but in an economy where the population, the aging population, is having an increasing burden. And this isn't a new story, it's an old story. In fact, the worst of it is actually slightly past for them. Now, it's China that's now got the big issue as far as they're concerned in managing that debt. But the impact of this long-term financing it and the amount that's in there will impact on other bond yields around the world because it's sucking in more money into that. If, however, that changes, then you'll see money flowing out of it again. And where does it actually go to? Good opportunity there for governments who are showing financial responsibility, hard to find these days, who would therefore attract more money coming in. Now, Britain was always seen as a solid place to be. Dull, maybe, but we never actually defaulted on our debt. Even parts of America defaulted on our debt. We've never done so. But nonetheless, people look at it and say, actually, you may not go bust, but I'm not sure I trust you as much as before. I tell you what, I'll buy into your bond market, but I'm going to have to get a better return than I'm going to get now. Yeah. And that's why we haven't seen those yields be quite as beneficial, frankly, as they should be. So we need to get more confidence back into that. And how do you do that? And the answer is getting the economy, government, to focus on the growth areas of the UK economy, making sure capital is directed towards those areas, and lo and behold, you start seeing more, that vital word in the economy, confidence coming back in, and that'll bring it in. The advantage then Britain's got over, say, something like France or Germany is because we are so international that people will actually understand investing in Britain and the UK is actually very easy and straightforward. It's not seen as such a big risk as it would be going to the French market and their rather strange rules and regulations. So we're missing out on something here. We need to be attracting more investments coming because, as you were implying a little earlier, London's got this great strength. No, London, actually, the UK, because Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Manchester are big financial services sectors in their own right. And it's not just the stock market, it's the accountants, the lawyers, all the other hangers-on that go with it, even down to the wretched PR people as well, that actually make sure this is our probably most important industry and needs to be not protected, it actually needs to be encouraged. And we're going to see some reforms so far, but looks like they're coming forward to actually help the UK market become a bit more attractive, certainly in terms of IPOs, the initial public offering, so that people have a bit more confidence in it. And that's what they need to be able to be doing to attract more of that international business. But we need to be careful. We used to sit there about, 15 years ago and say how clever we were attracting all these Russian mining companies coming in. Well, the reason they floated in London, because they wouldn't have actually been able to float in New York, because the directors would have been thrown into prison for breaking the regulatory rules. Here, we were much more relaxed about that. I mean, have a better choice of prisons, I suppose. But so be wary. We want to attract businesses coming to us, and we can service them, make sure they've got a good investment and a market which is liquid, not always so liquid, but providing the ability to be able to trade in and out as necessary. And that's very attractive to people, and not necessarily being sucked into Uncle Sam and suddenly dominated by America. People want to say, yeah, like America, invest in it, but I don't want them to run the whole thing. I need to be able to have something outside that. Britain has the ability to be the great outsider and to be able to take that position, in my view, take it back, which I'm afraid it's lost over the past 20 years.
I think for me, a big outstanding question, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again over the coming weeks, is this big move upwards in Japanese bond yields very unusual? Is that a kind of canary in the coal mine for global markets? Is that pointing to a running out of patience of global investors, the kinds of pension funds, insurance companies, charities, endowments that lend serious money to governments around the world? Are they losing patience? But let's just park that, Justin, because in the last few minutes, I do want to ask you about your thoughts about the City of London in particular. You are an extremely well-known figure in the square mile. You've had huge experience over many, many years, and I know you have many, many conversations with people about the City of London, and you care about it a great deal. Yeah. Why is it that so many companies delisted in 2024 and 2025? Why is it that London, in terms of IPOs, is now barely in the top 20 in the world? We've got all this expertise. My studio here is literally, a few hundred meters from the financial capital of Europe, as we like to call it, and yet you got all these legal expertise, all that accounting expertise, all the PR expertise, as you say, all the razzmatazz of big global publications here, media companies. Why has London lost the Midas touch in terms of hosting new companies, keeping companies here when it's such a lucrative business? And it's been years and decades and centuries even in the making to get us to this point.
Now, well, there are 2 points I think are really crucial. One is the obvious one, cost. It's almost as though they charge what you like, they're going to come to us anyway, so we can get away with costs, which are frankly outrageous and unnecessary as well. No, it's not a matter of saying this is a competitive market. No, I'm afraid it's almost run as a cartel. And even Big Bang, we saw that. Commissions to a great extent, or certainly fees, some of them were fixed. That's one issue. The other key issue is it's an old-fashioned thing. It's a stock market. You market a market. You go out and you actually promote the market, saying, this is what we can do for you, which others can't do quite so well. This is why you need to be here. We've got the ability to buy, sell in, sell out, choose the sort of investors that you want to have. You don't just want any old investors. You want people going to support your business, give you expertise, maybe even be customers. You never know what they're going to be like. But you have to go out and convince people internationally that actually London does actually have its impetus back and is the right place to be, but also market it in the United Kingdom as well. Because again, you go outside the City of London, nobody knows, nobody cares, they're not interested at all. But go to those high-tech areas, they're interested in, because they want to know where the capital is. The choice they've got at the moment is, well, they wait for someone coming across from California and say, that's a great bit of technology. Tell you what, come and see me in the Sunshine Belt. And they buy out. And the private equity people, they've been able to, there are good guys and bad guys, but an awful lot of bad guys, because their answer to this was, what you need is an efficient balance sheet. which in English means you're going to cover yourself in debt. And they're not going to give you debt. You're going to have the debt in your name, but they'll arrange it for you for a fee. And in 3 years' time, they'll sell out because that's what they do. They're not longer term. Oh, no, they'll say, sometimes you go to 5 years. That's because you couldn't sell it in 3 years. What I wanted to find, and there are firms like that, a lot of them, some of the old-fashioned investment trusts and things like that, and some of the old private family trusts, and their average investment period was 10 to 15 years. That's what you want to be able to see. Longer term investing to actually what goes on, not just in equities, but also in bonds. Why aren't we able to issue bonds relating to, say, replacing Hammersmith Bridge in London, or the bypasses going across from Newcastle through to Carlisle? These things which are vital, which the politicians in Westminster are never going to deal with. You always hear every year they'll come up with two things, one of which is Heathrow's another runway, good heavens, and some wretched railway line going from Oxford to Cambridge. And that's it, and then everyone laughs about it. It's really important, and get away from that. And once you start seeing more of that focus going to the regions, you release that regional money to invest in local things, companies, infrastructure, and you'll get more money running through the system. More money through the system, you're getting greater than movement through the economy. Anytime money moves, there's going to be a charge, there's going to be taxation. That's when you start seeing the economy getting to grow. Focus then on the biggest employers in the country, small businesses, encourage them by way of not extra money. EIS, Enterprise Investment Schemes, a great scheme which costs the government absolutely nothing until the company goes bust. You can do that on a regional basis. These things are straightforward, but we have politicians, I have to say, frankly, on any party, they don't know, they don't understand. And the Treasury, of course, and the civil service, bless their cotton socks, haven't changed really since the first editions or programmes of Yes Minister. They're still in that lovely, charming, old-fashioned world, but they really are. I'm not so beaver in the blob, but they are really brakes on the system because they don't understand, and they're frightened about having the changes that we're having to deal with, and particularly not trusting pompous gits from the city like me turning up saying, I've got a new idea for you, and they don't trust us. Well, that's down to us. We should actually make our arguments better. And some of the things we did in the past, like the privatisations, have come back to haunt us with water and things like that. And again, that just was done badly because of the lack of experience and understanding. That's no excuse for today.
If only you were city minister. Crikey, it could happen. You heard it here first. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, thanks so much for joining us.
A great pleasure, Liam. Great to speak to you again. Thank you.
Ben Aris, great to have you with us. Is it true to say that we are now in, or very fast approaching, a new world order?
Absolutely. We're already in it. The changes since Trump came in have been enormous. I think people haven't caught up to the enormity of the change. That, it started back at the end of the Second World War with the UN Charter in 45, followed by the GATT Agreement on Trade and Bretton Woods, which dealt with finances, and that set the basis for the New World Order. And that was followed on by the Helsinki Accords in the mid-70s, which thrust out the relationships, particularly in Europe, between Europe and the Soviet Union. But that put a whole bunch of things in and firmed up the initial round by guaranteeing sovereignty, tying things like economics, human rights into that world order. And since Trump's come in, he's just thrown all of that stuff out of the window. And, if you read The Economist, they're talking about a new economic paradigm. And we've gone back to 19th century or even Elizabethan imperialism, might makes right. That Trump's using economic tools that should have been about cooperation and prosperity and open borders, free trade, etc. And he's using them as weapons in order to promote American interests, to the detriment of his long-standing partners. And Europe is the one that's key in focus here, because as he's revived this so-called the Monroe Doctrine in the new national security strategy, and upgraded it to the Donroe Doctrine, which is basically, I'm going to take what I want, and if you're not willing to give it to me, then I'll either impose tariffs if I can't attack you because you're normally a partner or a NATO member. And in the case of Venezuela, who's not covered by those conditions, I will attack you militarily and kidnap your president and take control of your oil sector. And you just don't do this. I mean, of course, we're just all talking about the military invasion of Greenland, but the idea that US NATO country would attack EU NATO country, Greenland, Denmark, is insane. It destroys the transatlantic alliance, which means those relationships now count for nothing. Whether he's actually going to do it, highly unlikely, but just the threat of doing it has already undermined NATO. It's, the confidence in Article 5 is evaporated. And this is one of the US's closest allies, Canada, same story. Xi Jinping and Putin are looking on at this, and they I don't know, they must be laughing or opening the champagne as a result, because they were complaining about the unipolar order, which is actually what Trump is trying to impose. But by the methods he's using to do it, attacking his closest allies, he's destroying any credibility the US had and creating a multipolar world. And in Europe, they haven't got much choice, but the rest of the global South are watching on, and they didn't want to get dragged into this. And now they're like, we need to protect ourselves against US aggression. And that means they're being driven into the Chinese Russia camp as part of these new G20 BRICS, whichever group you want to lump them in. And that's going to continue. And the last thing I'll say, the evidence of that is Indonesia, which is the fourth largest country in the world, biggest Muslim country in the world, has been sitting on the fence with regards to BRICS membership for the last couple of years. And last January, they looking at what's going on, and they joined. They joined the BRICS, so they put themselves in that global South bloc for protection, and that's going to continue. You look at the relationship between India and the West as well. That they also Modi wanted to sit on the fence, and he's also thrown himself in to a relationship, particularly with Russia, which is very shocking. I talk to the Indians quite a lot, and they're very angry at the way they've been treated by the West, particularly the States. And they're now firm partners with Russia and the West. Trump has been trying to stop them trading in Russian oil, and they're like, get not it. That's in our interest. We got like $15 discount on oil. We're not going to give that up, regardless of what you do, regardless of what tariffs you put on.
Let's just spool back to the beginning of the year. It seems so long ago. Crikey, we're not even at the end of January. It's as if, decades of history have happened.
We're not even through 1 year of Trump. That's still to come. I think it's actually today, isn't it? Like a year ago that he was inaugurated, or yesterday.
Crikey. Let's just spool back to the beginning of the year. Venezuela. I mean, you've written in your latest Radio Moskva blog on your Substack, and also on your excellent website, BNE IntelliNews, about Venezuela. You've covered it extensively. Just talk us through what the America actually did in Venezuela. We don't need to, I think, lament the removal of Nicolas Maduro as the Venezuelan president, but just talk about what happened practically on the ground, because I think it is pretty shocking.
It's extremely shocking. And look, I think this is a part of an escalation. I mean, if you look at Trump, he's becoming progressively more aggressive. The tools he's reaching out for are increasingly aggressive. It started with the Ukraine peace process, and America came in and said, like, yes, under Trump, we're going to support Ukraine if you do a minerals deal. And that was key. And if you remember, that was a very painful process where the deal was finally signed in April, giving away these critical minerals concessions to the states. But that was economic coercion. But with Venezuela in particular, they chose a military option, which was very shocking. Because the idea that the states can fly, Black Hawks into Caracas, bomb it 5 o'clock in the morning, grab the sitting president, kidnap him, how else do you describe it? And his wife, yeah. And take them back to the States and put them on trial in New York, which has no jurisdiction, on charges of owning a machine gun. I mean, the whole thing is laughable. And the really shocking thing, and the part of that story which has really not been reported, although, the press has done its duty and actually mentioned it, was that there were 100 presidential guards, of which a third of them were Cubans, were just slaughtered in cold blood as part of the operation. So you came in, and then with money, it seems that they bribed people within the Venezuelan elite to execute Maduro's personal guard. So 100 people, bodies on the floor, in an hour. And then the SEAL Team 6, or whichever one it was, came in, snatched him, and flew him off to the States to put him on trial. So this is escalation, because it's not even ignoring the sovereignty of Venezuela. It's like just blatant piracy, mafia tactics where you grab the guy you don't like. And there wasn't even any attempt to dress it up as saving democracy. Trump was specifically asked, like, you've been complaining about political prisoners in jail because the Maduro regime is a regime. It's very nasty. It jails people it doesn't like. And one of the journalists on Air Force One said, look, what about the political prisoners? Are you going to let them go? And Trump's answer was like, well, we might get to that further down the road, but in the meantime, the US oil companies are going in. And he didn't even try to pretend that there was any, high-minded justification for this, which normally, they dress it up. At least they make the effort to dress it up as like, ousting Saddam Hussein as a nasty dictator. In this case, Trump was just completely blatant. We're there for the oil. We're going to take the oil. And it's important for the states. I mean, again, if you drill into the oil story, the oil that's in the Orinoco Belt, 303 billion barrels, huge. I mean, compared to Russia, which has 80 billion in reserves, it's massive. The refineries in this story goes back to the 70s. The refineries in the States, they believed that the era of light sweet oil was over. And then they built all these refineries that can deal with this, basically this toxic sludge that comes out of the Gulf. Mexico has the same kind of oil. But then the shale revolution happened, and that's a light sweet grade. And so again, it's been put off. But the shale revolution is now peaking, which means we're going to go back to the heavy crude. And the US has 7 refineries geared to this very difficult to refine oil.
And that's
And
what
they're not doing anything.
specializes in, right?
Yeah, and they're not doing anything. They're struggling to get supplies. And suddenly, and in this sense, it looks insane, but this is something I'll come back to, that Trump's focus on commodities, oil, critical minerals, I actually think it's right. And that this is the one thing that he's really understood, and he's actually right about it, because although everyone, if you read the reports, the first pass, and we did the same thing, was saying like, this is insane. This oil is, the amount of investment that has to go into getting out of the ground and rebuilding the infrastructure is whatever it is, $100 billion. But what he's done is he's supplied the major refineries down there in that corner of the US, who are all geared towards this oil, with a generation more, several generations worth of supply of this very unpleasant oil. And he said we're going to make our money from the black gold in the ground.
And also
and
maybe giving China a headache, given that China had taken quite a lot of that.
well, that's a bonus. I mean, that's another part of his agenda, because the Monroe Doctrine is like, we control the Western Hemisphere. So this taking over Venezuela is part of that, because it's no longer about UN Charter and, international rules based. It's simply like, we're the states, Western Hemisphere is ours. We can do what we like. That Venezuela is sitting on feedstock that we desperately need and will feed our major refineries for several generations and keep the money coming. So we're taking that.
Yeah.
And if you look at it from that perspective, this mercantile new paradigm perspective he's pursuing, then he's doing exactly a sensible thing. Just like you said at the very beginning, the rules-based order is out the window. It doesn't count for anything anymore.
Just incredible what's happened in America. It wasn't too many years ago, Ben, as you know well, that exporting oil from America was actually illegal, a sort of construct of the Nixon era, when America suffered during that Arab oil embargo and the first oil price shock in 1973. And yet now, with the shale revolution, America's become a significant oil exporter. And if it's refining and turning around hydrant of Venezuelan crude, I mean, America's export earnings from oil are only going to get bigger. I think what I want to do, Ben, BNE Intellinews has people on the ground in Iran. You've developed Iran coverage over recent years, and chapeau to you for that. I want to ask you about Iran briefly. God, geopolitics moving so quickly. I want to ask you briefly about the possibility of regime change in Iran. I mean, pivotal Middle Eastern power. It's incredible. Before we move on to Greenland and indeed Russia, Ukraine, which I think really is your specialist subject. So let's just talk briefly about Iran. You're in touch with your correspondents in Iran often. What's happened? It's kind of dropped out of the news, even though we've seen the biggest protests, possibly the strongest push towards regime change in Iran since the Ayatollahs took over in 1979.
It's hardcore. I mean, it kicked off on December 28th, when the real, which is all the currency, was doing badly, but it just collapsed. And what happened was in the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, which is a focal point, the shop keepers closed their shops because they were saying it's impossible to do business. I mean, we're not just talking about a rapidly devaluing kind of currency. We have no idea what the money is worth. And so we're not selling anything because, you know, today it costs 1 million real and tomorrow it's going to cost 2 billion. And then the day after it's going to go back. And so they just shut up shop. And that sparked protests. And this is, I think, third major protest that they've had since the revolution in 79. But this has turned into by far the most significant. For reference, 2019 was the last big protest where 1,500 people were killed. We're struggling to put numbers on the deaths, but you know the range is somewhere between 6,000 and 20,000 dead now. So this was, and that's what stopped it. 28th December was when it kicked off, but then Rezi Pahlavi, the son of the Tsar, has got involved, and I think it was on January 8th he broadcast to the country. And then that was piped into all of the cities. Of course, the TV was under state control, but what they organized was it piped the speech to speakers in the city center. The whole country came to a standstill, listened to that speech, and that sparked really massive protests. With all 31 provinces of the entire country rose up. Every major city, there was a protest. And it's like with Minsk, the mass protests in 2020, the security forces were simply overwhelmed by the numbers. There was just too many people. And there were shooting incidences from the beginning, but the crowds had control of the street. So we had this period of about 4 or 5 days where it looked like the regime was going to collapse. But it's Iran, and the internet blackout helped because what they did was just put soldiers on every street corner who were given orders to just shoot anybody who came out. Mm. And from one day to the next, the protests diminished massively. At the same time, the social media pictures and videos that were coming out via Starlink showed, like, you know, the back of the Tehran cemetery was just wall to wall body bags. And they just started killing people in massive numbers. And unlike Minsk, you can't get away with that. I think the reaction from Europe to if Lukashenko had taken the guns out, if you remember that there was a point where he came very close to shooting into the crowd, but never crossed that line. But in Iran, they don't have any restrictions like that. They don't care about international reaction, and they know the international community won't do anything. I think in Minsk, there would have been a possibility of military intervention by, I don't know, Putin threatened to do it, but we wouldn't tolerate a sort of Rwanda-style massacre in Minsk in the way that we do tolerate Rwanda-style massacres in Iran. And now it seems to have petered out because from the reports we're getting, again, it's spotty. There's military everywhere. Toyota trucks with 50 caliber machine guns on the back of them. And if you have more than 10 people standing together protesting with a poster, they'll just get mowed down. And I think the Ayatollahs have taken back control. What we're waiting to see, I mean, the key there's two paths to a protest. One, you need over 3% of the population on the streets, and normally a regime falls if you get that. You got that in Minsk, and we got that in Iran. But the second part of it is the security forces have to lose confidence in the regime and change sides. And we didn't get that in Minsk because of Putin promised to bring in military support and shored up the support to Lukashenko, the security forces, and in Iran to the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, fanatics, and they remain loyal to the Ayatollahs. And there was a question mark over the general soldiers. I mean, but there were the IRGC are the key there, and they haven't changed sides. And without that, there's not going to be regime change. So where we are now is obviously the regime is in deep trouble. So we're looking and expecting there to be some changes within the elite. And then it remains to be seen how that's going to play out. Could well be one general who has more moderate ideas. The Pashinyan, the president, is more liberal and has been trying to talk to the protesters. He's talking about economic reforms in order to improve the quality of life. So I think we'll see some shake-up, some changes, some new policies in order to address this. But the theocracy as it stands will remain in place. Khamenei himself probably also, but he might delegate more to a more liberal fraction. But having said all of that, we're still anticipating a US strike on Iran in an attempt to topple it, because from the US Israeli point of view, if you're going to change the regime, now's the time to do it. And there was nearly a strike last week, but the Israelis and the Arabs themselves, particularly Saudi, told Trump to hold off. And the issue there is that Israelis, in particular, if there is going to be a strike, there's obviously going to be a retaliation. Israel's in the front line, but there's no US warships in the Gulf. They're in the Pacific.
Right.
And you need those. Those were key during the short war that was last summer, because from there you can fly F-16s that bring down missiles. You've got big missiles on the ships themselves that can do the strike. And as a military asset, you need big US warships in the Gulf in order to do that. And they've been ordered to leave the Pacific, and they're on their way at the moment to the Gulf, and they're due to arrive, end of this week, sometime next week. And then that gives Trump the military option again. And from what we hear in Tehran, they're terrified of this because they've been threatening to strike back, not just Israel, but US bases all across the Middle East, which are all in striking range. Interestingly, in Qatar, where they did hit a very symbolic strike before, in so much as the Iranians told the Americans before they sent the missiles that they were about to strike it. So the base was emptied. It was just a token, to show that you can't hit us with impunity. But this time round, the Iranians have said, the base has been emptied again of senior US officials. But Iran released a statement saying, we know which hotel all your officers are staying in, threatening to take out American personnel. So if there is a second strike, this one's going to be much more vicious. I mean, they're actually going to try and kill as many Americans as possible, which they definitely didn't do before.
All
So
this,
this is
all this
all this.
going on is barely in the news in the Western world. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
That's what we do. I mean, we follow the details, from the ground. The trouble with the Western press, and you and I have both worked in the Western press, basically all our careers, is there's a very European perspective. And how does this relate? The whole Greenland thing, it's not about the minerals and Trump's problem with his dependency on China, which is actually what's driving his foreign policy. It's all about, well, what does this do to US-European relationships and the EU, and will we get into a trade war, and what will be the impact on cost of living in the UK or in Chicago? And all these big questions, these enormous changes that are going on, are being ignored. And this comes to your point about, new world order, that the reporting is still as if it was before.
Yeah.
And there's an assumption of EU-US special relationships, and that needs to be repaired. And it doesn't take into account that the world has just changed massively. And we have
Well,
these
saying, Ben,
big,
that EU-US trade is $1.5 trillion. US-China trade is more like $0.5 trillion. And yet trade rows between China and the US, almost roiled international markets. A proper trade row between the EU and the US is actually far more significant in terms
yeah.
of the numbers. Look, it's
It's the
obviously
biggest trade fair in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's going to impact global growth. But then if you look at the global south, what's happened as a result of these changes, everyone's diversifying away from the States as fast as they can. And that's manifest in the de-dollarization, where trade is still settled in dollars, but the reserves have plummeted. The dollar holding has plummeted.
Yeah.
And we're watching the trade it's switched within a month or two, whereas you exported to the States, you're now looking for new markets. And that was most obvious in the oil sanctions on Russia, where in the space of 4 months, they reorientated their entire oil export, 70% of which went to Europe. They reorientated it to Asia in 4 months. And 4 months is the number there. That's just because it used to take a week for a tanker to go from Primorsk to Rotterdam. And now it takes 2 months to get to Asia and come back. And so after you've had that 4 months, you've then got the conveyor belts, and all the exports went back to normal. It just takes, the trip itself takes longer and it's more expensive, but the flow of oil goes back to normal.
Yeah.
And I don't think the West has woken up to this. It's like the threats Trump's making is like the rest of the world's like, all right, bring it on.
Yeah.
We'll just do business with each other. And actually, there's 80% of the world's population is in our camp in the global south, and you've got less than 1 billion people in yours.
Indeed. Incredible news flow going on so far in January. We're getting way over time, Ben, and I do need to ask you about Greenland briefly.
Go
What's
ahead.
America's rationale in Greenland? Is it rare earths? Is it Golden Dome? Is it trying to police the increasingly important Northwest Passage? Is it a combination of all three? And then I briefly want to ask you about Russia, Ukraine.
So there's two aspects to this, security aspect and the rare earths. And like I alluded to before, Trump is actually right about America's dependency on rare earths in particular. Goes into things like magnets, and your iPod headphones won't work without rare earths. And America doesn't have any. And this has actually been an issue. This came up at least a decade ago. There's a very famous report from, I think it's the Department of Energy, pointing out that already more than a decade ago, the US was entirely dependent on a monopoly in rare earths critical minerals that China was producing. And given America's emphasis on tech, they've just been asleep ever since. And the problem hasn't changed. And they've done nothing about it.
China has 1% of it's not the deposits of the rare earths, it's the production and the processing.
The processing.
So you can use them in factories. That's what China totally dominates.
Yeah. And China already more than a decade ago had made the investments. And this is also rare earths processing is extremely dirty and environmentally costly, which is one of the reasons why the West hasn't done it, because it just screws up the land around it. So you don't want it. It's very hard to do. And China has done this, out in Western China where there's no people. And it's also very expensive. You have to do it at massive scale. I mean, enormous scale. And the investments in that are ginormous. And so commercially for a private company, it's difficult because you have to go in with like hundreds of billions of investment from the get-go in order to be competitive. So China's put itself in a position where it's unassailable, both on environmental grounds and investment grounds. And Trump has realized this, and he's realized the States has been asleep, and he's realized that this is actually more than an Achilles heel, that China can just switch off American high tech just completely.
Is Greenland a viable source of rare earth deposits?
Yes. What Trump is
doing. Very
hostile
environment, obviously, and there's going to be no immediate bounty, is there?
No, I mean, the investment like Venezuelan oil, I mean, you're talking hundreds of billions and you're talking a decade. But funnily enough, I'm in a weird position where, Trump is looking a bit like a visionary here in so much as he's like, we need to get those resources. We need to get the concessions now, and we need to make the investments, and it's going to cost a heap of money, and it's going to take a decade before any of this comes online. So we're still exposed, but that's what we're going to do. And if you're thinking long-term strategy, he's absolutely right. Unless they come to some sort of arrangement with China and China becomes friends with the States so that it actually supplies this stuff. But of course, China and Beijing is going to use it as a lever in the same way that Trump would. And Greenland is part of that. So, Trump sells himself as a peacemaker after a Nobel Prize. But actually behind that, I think of the 8 deals that he claims to have brokered, 6 of them came with major mineral concessions. And that was most conspicuously started with Ukraine when he took over. His first round of talks was what's the US going to do to support Ukraine? And he went in and demanded this minerals deal. There was this fantasy that Ukraine was full of rare earths. It has no rare earths at all, but it does have significant critical minerals, in particular graphite, and I think it has a third of all of Europe's lithium deposits, which is key. And if you remember, that was a very, very painful negotiation, which finally got signed in April last year. But then you look at Greenland, it's the same thing. I mean, Trump alluded to the critical minerals in his speech yesterday at Davos. He downplayed them, but in subsequent comments, he's made it completely clear that's what they're interested in. So it means that there probably won't be a war nor an invasion because it's not necessary. They don't want it as a 51st state. They just want access to the minerals. So Greenland just needs to sign off on some concession deals, major mining deals, because the stuff in Greenland hasn't been touched. And it's, as I said, of the 8 peace deals, there were 6 mineral concessions, and we're now talking about a seventh one. And so he's actually putting in place a nice portfolio of major deposits of rare earth and critical minerals, which will then presumably be developed over the next decade. Second aspect of this, and this is actually much more scary, is the security aspect. So
Oh.
he's been selling this fantasy that Greenland is under threat from China and Russia. Neither Russia nor China have any aspirations in Greenland whatsoever. The Chinese Foreign Ministry came out, made that crystal clear at the start of this week, and complained and told Trump to stop using this fake China threat to justify his actions. But they have a military base there, and if they build that up, which they could do because the deal they have with Greenland is there's no cap on the number of forces they can put into their bases, then suddenly you've got a NATO base on Russia's northern border, which you didn't have before. Now, from Greenland, US missiles can strike into the heart of Russia, into Siberia, Irkutsk. There are major strategic bombers that are positioned there. There are major missile silos there, which are out of reach from Europe. If you fly from Romania and Poland into Siberia, they're so far away, the Russians are going to have like half a day warning of any missiles. But those coming from Greenland are much shorter flight time, and they can hit a lot of the strategic stuff, which is so far been out of range. And this is basically the Ukraine scenario again. Putin went to war, invaded Ukraine because of simple threats of possible NATO missiles going in to the Ukrainian border, which can reach the whole of European Russia, where 80% of the population lives. But if now Trump puts military bases and beefs up the ones he's got in Greenland, Russia's going to react. And look at the way they reacted to Ukraine. So this is a major destabilizing factor of American military presence in Greenland. And it just makes everything worse.
Ben, we are way, way, way over time, but I have to ask you very, very briefly, if you will, is there any chance of some kind of resolution in the grinding conflict between Russia and Ukraine, now quickly approaching its fourth anniversary since full-scale escalation and invasion in February 2022?
I think the war's over. There's nowhere to go from here. And the problem is that the half-hearted response, we stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. It's actually been stand with Ukraine as long as it doesn't cost us too much money. And the half-hearted, the promise of F-16s, the promise of Leopard tanks, that you needed to send 200-300 of each in order to make a difference in the war. And in the end, we sent a token 9 F-16s and 35 Leopards, which made no difference on the battlefield. So we've never been
serious. What does the deal look
serious.
like? Are we going to have Western troops in East Ukraine in some kind of buffer zone? Is the Kremlin going to accept that?
No, the Kremlin's made adamantly clear. I mean, the whole point of this war is to keep NATO troops out of Ukraine. So we're working up to concession. If you listen to Bankova, the comments they've been making, they've now conceded the need for territorial concessions. Russia keeps all five of the regions that it occupies. That they're going to have to give up the Donbass. They're going to have to give up the defensive line. And they're going to have to reduce their military, although there's ways around that using reservist forces. And Zelensky, he quite rightly is focused entirely on security guarantees. He needs to ensure Ukraine's borders against a second invasion, and for that he needs Article 5-like guarantees. And the Trump team have actually put up the offer of a 10-year deal with a military component, a commitment that would work. It's not entirely clear if the Kremlin will accept that, but it probably will, because that's not a NATO commitment, and that was its main objection, was specifically NATO missiles. So they might accept a US deal. But Zelensky's very nervous. He hasn't got his security guarantee, and that's what he's holding out for. He's due to meet Trump today. They have de facto conceded giving up Donbass, although giving up the defensive line in Donetsk is going to be very painful, but I don't think they have a choice. And Putin now is tightening the screw, and he's been threatening to black out Ukraine by hitting not just the power stations, but the infrastructure, the substations in particular. And that's happened now. And so the temperatures in Kiev apartments are now -5, and there's an exodus that's begun already. People leaving, I think several 100,000 people have left the capital in the last few days. And they can't keep that up. You're looking at a humanitarian crisis. You're looking at the collapse of society. The shops have already closed down, so people are running out of food. So we're very close to the end. And Zelensky himself said that the war could be over by summer. And that's the first time he put a timeline on it. So, and if you listen to him, he's sounding increasingly desperate because they've run out of their defense ammo. Because before in Kiev, people got very blasé about the air raid sirens because the shield they have, the Patriots, was very effective and very little got through. And now the skies are wide open, and you're seeing the reports. It's like one city after another is being blacked out. And the cold weather is going to continue for another 6 weeks. So this 6 weeks could see the whole thing collapse. And like I say, the meeting today is another opportunity for Zelensky to give up. But it turns on whether he's willing to do that without having a security guarantee. And he's insisting on that. The demographics of it, EU's just raised 90 billion to keep Ukraine in the war for another 2 years. That's going to kill. If you look at the demographic curve, the pyramid for Ukraine, it's like a triangle, but now 25 years old, it goes like this. A whole generation is dead. And if you carry on for another 2 years, they have no more men. So they're going to drop conscription to 18. They have no choice because it's 26 now. And you're going to lose another generation. So even if the war stops in 2 years' time, Ukraine is screwed as a country because that whole generation, the cost of not having those people and no babies is I don't know, it's horrific. This is worse than the Second World War. And the country, so just from the demographic catastrophe point of view, they have to stop now. They can't afford to lose a second generation of young people. The burden of having lost one generation already is going to be so enormous that I think people haven't quite got their head around how catastrophic a situation it is.
Ben Aris, absolutely fascinating as ever. We've gone way over time. I do think it's been absolutely worth it. You are the expert of BNE Intellinews, and thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, if I can give the publication a plug, I mean, look us up on intellinews.com. We cover the whole world, 5 big territories: Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and former Soviet Union space, Eurasia. And also on there, on the right-hand side, you'll see a button for Editor's Picks. Sign up to that. It's a free digest of our best stories the last 24 hours. And you can follow me personally at Twitter at BNE Editor, and I have a Substack called Radio Moskva, where I blog every day about whatever's of interest.
Great to have you with us. Cheers.
My pleasure.
Now, the UK steel industry still directly employs tens of thousands of people, yet the sector is in a sorry state, with the closure of 2 of the UK's last blast furnaces in Port Talbot back in September 2024. With large UK government-backed procurement contracts being awarded to Chinese steel suppliers, huge question marks loom over British steelmaking. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome Simon Boyd, Managing Director of Reed Steel, to the When the Facts Change studio. Simon, great to have you with us. We've talked about the British steel industry over a number of years. Just tell viewers about your experience in the British steel industry, who you are, what is Reed Steel, and the amount of time you've been involved in this vital sector.
Yeah, well, I've been in the steel sector most of my working life, and so I'm really connected to it right from the shop floor all the way up through the management chain, if you like. And, Reed Steel in particular, we design and fabricate all sorts of structures that made of steel, whether it's defense structures, bridges, hangars, industrial buildings, all those kind of everyday things that you would expect. And we export all over the world, and we've been going for 107 years this year. But it's never been so tough. And it's tough because for certainly the last 5-6 years, if not longer, particularly when we were in the EU, I was fighting for regulatory reform because there was lots of threats facing the industry.
Yeah.
And if you look at what's happened in the past, a lot of our heavy manufacturing has been hollowed out, and the same is happening to the steel industry now, which you can see with the 2 closures you've had down at Port Talbot, and the threats over the last two remaining blast furnaces that we have in Scunthorpe.
Let's just go back to September 2024. I remember writing about the closure of the blast furnaces in Port Talbot at the time. I remember reading about the history of Port Talbot, how that incredibly famous, iconic Welsh steelworks had really pioneered a lot of modern steel manufacturing methods. How big a deal was it that Port Talbot closed? How big a deal is it that the UK now has only 2 remaining blast furnaces?
Well, it's massive, and I think the British people need to ask themselves, really, is do we want to be a maker of steel in the UK? We're the only, if we let steel making go, we'll be 100% reliant on imports. And that's for, there's a big difference between virgin steel and steel that's made from scrap. Okay.
So virgin steel is superior strength steel made with coking coal in a blast furnace. Steel made from scrap is arc furnaces run by electricity rather than coking coal. They're different products, right?
Completely different. One has more carbon in them than the other. Okay. So they call steel that comes from electric arc furnace green steel.
Yeah.
They don't take into the equation where the energy come from to generate the electricity.
Yeah, of course they don't.
Which is why you can see overseas countries using coal-fired power stations to generate the electricity to power their EAFs. But let's not go down that road. Let's look at what's happening in the UK. So we do need EAFs. It's a good
electric
idea.
Arc furnaces, yeah. Because
We've
we've got a lot of scrap metal. Why not turn it into usable steel?
And you can do that.
Yeah.
You can do that. And there's plenty of uses for steel coming from EAFs.
But why is virgin steel so important?
Well, there's 2 factors here. One is there's only enough scrap in the world to provide about 1/3 of the demand for steel.
Okay. So we can still go back to iron ore and coking coal, traditional steel making in a blast furnace.
That's right. Now, so we started this off in the Industrial Revolution. Okay. And while I know there's no God-given right to maintaining something forever in a day, I think it's absolutely essential to any serious power that they have the ability to make their own steel. Because if you're not, you're reliant on someone else, whichever way you look at it, you're relying on someone else.
As a steelman to your fingertips, what are the applications where only virgin steel will do? As an amateur observer, I'm told there are certain defense applications where you definitely need that super strength virgin steel. There are some construction situations where virgin steel is superior. How important is it that we can at least source virgin steel?
Well, I think it's vitally important, not just for the UK market and and all the other steel industries that take that steel and turn it into something else. Okay, so if you think we should be an exporter of slab, that's come from virgin steel.
Yeah,
that's the highest quality steel, so we can export that. But that means we've got to do something about the costs of making the steel. Now, if you look at the last 2 blast furnaces we've got left.
In Scunthorpe. Owned by the Chinese, Jinji.
Owned by Chinese, run by the Labour government.
Yeah.
Okay, because the Labour government has gone about 90% of the way to taking it back into public ownership, but it can't get over the last 10%. Because there's an argument now between Jinge and the Labour government as to what it's worth. Jonathan Reynolds at the time said...
Former business secretary
said £1. Jinge said £1 billion. So there's a bit of a gap there.
It could conceivably be worth £1 because, of course, this thing's got a lot of liabilities.
It has
a lot of debts, pension liabilities, all the rest of it.
Does. And, at the minute, it's costing the taxpayer, around about £700,000 per day.
To keep this thing running.
To keep the thing running. So, and it's a bit like you're just renting something that you're never going to see any material benefit out of at the moment. So it has to come back into fully under UK ownership, okay? Because if I just come back to the point where I was trying to get to earlier on, the technology in these blast furnaces dates back to the 1950s, and it's a proven technology. It makes the finest steel in the world, okay? But it's about somewhere between 5 and 10 years away from expiring. You know, it can't run much longer than that. You know, they have a...
The two skunk thought.
Yeah. So to invest in new blast furnaces is going to take a serious amount of money. In addition to that, we need 2 electric arc furnaces because that's a good idea that we can provide.
Because we have got lots of scrap.
We have.
And arc created steel is perfectly good in lots of situations.
It's perfectly good in lots of situations. But, you know, if we just go down that road of the EAF, we've then lost what we started, you know, which is the ability to make steel. And it's a question.
Is that about more than nostalgia? You obviously adore the steel industry. It's your life's work. As a hard-nosed economist, let me be cheeky enough. Is it just nostalgia, this need for blast furnaces?
No, it's not. You're going to lose the best skill set you could ever have. Money can't buy the skills that are employed in steel making. You just can't buy it. And look, let's just say the world is a volatile place today. All right? Globalization isn't really working out the way that they thought it'd work. And there's a big change coming. And it's more important than ever that we are able to make our own steel.
In a world where China's providing 50% plus of global steel output, you don't want to rely on China, right? You don't want to rely on steel coming through the Suez Canal, which may or may not be open.
That's absolutely right. I mean, look, we still have to get iron ore and all the other bits and bats into the country to be able to make the steel. But, you know, the reality at the moment is that China does have half the market, half the global market.
Crikey.
Okay?
Yeah.
And how's it got half the market? It's got half the market by going in and undercutting everybody in a particular market, getting rid of the competition, and then bumping their prices.
So subsidised producers have been flooding global export markets with steel, and then when they get a stranglehold, they can then push prices up.
Yeah, and the EU and the Americans put tariffs up to try and prevent that coming into their markets. So the Chinese just went into the other markets, you know, and they've got 50% share now. And, you know, the Chinese think far further ahead than our politicians do. And, you know, and the reason I say it's a question for the British people, you know, it is called British steel at the end of the day.
Yeah.
You know, the betrayal at Port Talbot, you know, is a real betrayal. You know, all those people, they had their livelihoods just...
And we should say, just to be clear, you know, you're a businessman. You're an executive. You've been an executive in the steel industry for a lot of your career. You're not a trade unionist. You obviously understand the importance of skilled labour in steelmaking, but you're not coming at this from a bleeding heart perspective. You're coming at this from a hard-nosed commercial perspective, right?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, look, any company is only as good as the people it invests in and it employs. And the steel industry in its entirety, and I'm talking not just about the steel making, but you've got to look down at the steel manufacturing. You know, the people that actually take the steel from British Steel and then turn it into something like the Shard.
Yeah.
Something, you know.
Huge tall building in central London.
You know, fantastic. We didn't personally do that job.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are some fantastic structures that have been made with British Steel, you know, and, you know, it's got a reputation worldwide. Why would we want to let that go? It does not make sense. And it's a proper... If you gave me, if the government was to give me the money, right, and I'm not putting myself up here for a job because I'm all right with the job I've got. But if you were to give me, anybody with a business sense on them, give me the tools, I'll turn that company round and it'll make money for the British people and the state, and then you bring your privatization back in, a privatization model that forbids that from ever being sold to a foreign body. Because you've got to keep some things British. I mean, look at the madness of what's going on at the moment with us losing so much, and I'm told, and it was reported in the Times, that a lot of this deal to do with the the acquiring of British steel from the Chinese to the government is linked to this embassy that's going on in London.
Do you think London's Labour's decision just now, recent days, to approve a very, very controversial super embassy in central London, right next to the City of London, with all kinds of rooms in the plans that are sort of, in quotes, secret. Yeah. You think that concession by Labour is linked to some kind of deal they're trying to do with the Chinese to buy the Scunthorpe plants?
Well, I don't think you have to be a brain surgeon to work that one out. Yeah. Look at what's going on. I mean, our Prime Minister's off to China next week, I believe. There's so many things afoot here. China, I think we're looking to China for a bailout, but it's going to cost us much more than money. We've got to get things back to being made in Britain.
Talking about cost, Simon, tell us about the impact as the British steel industry has been, enduring this onslaught, as the whole Western steel industry of Chinese product everywhere, often subsidised. What's been the impact in that context of net zero policies on your industry in terms not just of electricity costs, power costs, which of course are massively important in the steel industry, but in terms of how our use of steel has come under all kinds of regulatory constraints?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Let me shock you. The madness of net zero, right? So the UK government now runs British Steel, but it doesn't own it, okay? It's costing the taxpayer around about £700,000 a day. So
to keep that plant going.
To keep the plant going at the moment, right? Okay. And at the same time, Miliband's passion for low carbon everything, right? It means that anybody that wants anything built in the UK has to have low carbon content in whatever it is they're going to build. So when it comes to steel, the specifiers are going, we need low carbon steel, green steel.
So arc furnace steel, not blast furnace steel.
Yeah, and guess what? We don't have an arc furnace, do we? We have two blast furnaces. Yeah. So it's losing probably around 25 to 30% of work in the UK, right? And I've just been told the other day that in the Westminster Planning Control now have set that you must have green steel or low carbon steel.
So by definition for now, green steel used in the UK has to be imported because we're not using arc furnaces in the UK yet.
Yeah. So we're reducing, a blast furnace has to work 24 hours a day. So it's all about volume.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if it's generating volume that it can't sell into the UK market, it's having to export it for next to nothing overseas because it can't stop producing.
Yeah,
it's got to keep producing.
Of course.
So
you can't turn these things on, off and on.
No, you can't. So what comes out of Scunthorpe? These big steel slabs, they're massive, and then when they're going to be profiled into sections, they go up to Teesside and they get profiled into sections. So these slabs are all sitting there. If they can't sell them here because we're not allowed to do sections, so if you followed the Westminster ruling at the moment, the Shard and all the other fancy high rises in London, we wouldn't be able to build today with British steel.
Crazy.
It's just to try and get your head around that.
And then you've got the energy costs. We've got famously the most expensive energy costs in the Western world. What's the impact of that on steel makers? What's the impact on that in companies working across the steel industry generally? Not just producers of the steel, but the metal formers, the people who configure the components from the raw steel. Again, very energy intensive industry.
Well, again, and I can only say that our electric bills are still around about 300% higher than where they were pre-COVID. They were up to 400% higher. So some people may say, well, electricity prices are coming down. Yeah, they have come down.
But they're still
3 times
really high. And that's a massive
share of your cost base, right?
It is. But, if I come back to that point of how much it's costing the taxpayer a day, £700,000 a day, and British Steel has been prevented from fulfilling the potential order book in a domestic market, where that £700,000 a day that we're having to chip in may end up being zero, or maybe, dare I say, even a small profit.
Oh,
okay,
perish the thought.
Perish the thought. But and this is with 1950s technology.
Yeah.
Just imagine the opportunity here for having the latest blast furnace technology, for having carbon capture on the new blast furnaces. Well, that would satisfy, some of the
All the green rigmarole. Yeah.
Well, I don't think it would satisfy anyone. They don't complain when they're driving over their bridges or they're going into the buildings. Steel isn't just about everything that we do. But there is a real potential for turning this around with 2 EAFs and getting us back into an export market where we can export the highest quality steel across the world and be back at the centre of it, where it all started from.
Just finally, Simon, you're a well-connected guy. You're a very well-known person in the steel industry in general, an effective advocate for the industry, if I may say so. A lot of politicians, I'm told, watch When the Facts Change. What's your message to the next British government when it comes to not just saving our steel industry, but making our steel industry a net contributor to the British economy, not just in terms of employment, but in terms of, commercial sense too, and actually generating wealth for the UK?
Well, I think at the moment, it's really hard to be able to say anything about the current government that is positive unless they make a massive U-turn on their net zero policies. And it would take that to allow that investment to go into British Steel.
Yeah.
What I have heard is that they plan to shut down one blast furnace and open up an old EAF plant that's been lying dormant for 2 years in Rotherham that's owned by another company.
Okay.
But that would require nearly £1 billion worth of investment to change the rolling lines to suit the steel that could make. And what would happen if this happened? It would be a great betrayal. That's jobs going down the road. That's one blast furnace gone, one left. Okay? And if the other one packed in or went, we're down to less than half the capacity of what we can produce today. So it's going to take somebody. I have written to Peter Kyle, the current Secretary of State for Business. I've actually just signed a letter to him today asking for an emergency meeting. I've got 2 of my colleagues who run other steel companies, one being Contin Engineering and the other one being Billington Holdings. Because the 3 of us, we don't want any trade organisation there. We want to come round, we want to sit round the table with Peter Kyle, Kemi Badenoch, Nigel and Richard.
From Reform.
From Reform. And, we'll even sit down with the Lib Dems. I mean, that's about as far as we go with it.
Steady.
Well, look, it's not about being politically motivated on this, right? I can only say that there was 2 men that stood on the steps of British Steel that had a massive input into stopping the Chinese selling it down the river, right? And that was Nigel and,
So Nigel Farage and Richard Tice.
Yeah, they stood on the steps outside British
the top
Steel.
2 guys in Reform UK.
They did. I didn't see anybody from the Conservatives there. I didn't see anybody from the Labour Party there. And the Labour Party did do the right thing. The Labour Party, but it's not gone all the way.
Yeah.
And that's what they need to do. And, if they can just sit down with somebody like me and a couple of other colleagues, you can explain it, hopefully in the way I've tried to explain it to you, without any fancy words, just as it is. Do we want steel making in the UK?
Simon Boyd, Managing Director of Reed Steel, steel industry legend. Great to have you with us here on When the Facts Change. That's it, folks, for this week. Thanks so much for joining me here on the weekly show. Spread the word. When the Facts Change comes out every Friday morning. Thanks for being with me.
Thanks for joining When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world with me, Liam Halligan. Please subscribe to my When the Facts Change YouTube channel and my podcast via Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. And above all, please subscribe to my When the Facts Change Substack for more of my interviews and writing.